My name is Oliver Whitmore, 31 years old, and I work as a freelance architect in Brighton. My mother-in-law Margaret has never thought much of my career or my suitability for her daughter Sarah, but what happened last Tuesday changed everything between us forever. Sarah and I met 5 years ago at a pub quiz in Camden. She was finishing her PhD in marine biology, and I was just starting my own practice. We clicked immediately over terrible jokes and shared ambitions. Her parents, however, were a different story entirely. Margaret Whitfield is a retired headmistress who ruled her comprehensive school with an iron fist for 30 years. Her husband, David, spent his career as a senior civil servant in Whitehall. They live in a sprawling Victorian house in Hampstead that Margaret inherited from her parents, and they measure success entirely by pension schemes and job security. From our first meeting, Margaret made it clear she had reservations about me. "What exactly do you do?" she asked. When Sarah introduced us freelance architect, I replied, "Ah," Margaret said with that particular tone she reserved for disappointing students, "so you're unemployed then?" David was more direct during our second meeting. He pulled me aside in their conservatory son. He said, "Architecture is a precarious field, perhaps. You should consider something more stable before committing to my daughter," I assured him. My business was growing, but he just nodded with the expression of a man who had heard many foolish dreams. The criticism became relentless. Every Sunday roast at their house turned into an interrogation disguised as concern. "How many projects do you have lined up?" Margaret would ask. "What happens if the housing market crashes?" David would add. Sarah would squeeze my hand under the table, but I could see the doubt creeping into her eyes. Margaret had her own plans for Sarah. She frequently mentioned Simon Thornley, a doctor whose practice was thriving in Harley Street, such a sensible young man. She would say, "Always working, always reliable, not like these creative types who think the world owes them a living." The worst part was watching Sarah slowly absorb her mother's anxieties. She started questioning my decisions, asking if maybe I should look for something more permanent when I landed a major contract designing a boutique hotel in Cornwall instead of celebrating. Sarah wondered aloud what would happen when it finished. Last month, everything escalated. Sarah announced she was pregnant. We were both thrilled, but Margaret's response was immediate. "How will you support a family on irregular income?" She demanded. Children need stability, not dreams. The breaking point came at Margaret's birthday dinner last Tuesday. Sarah had been feeling unwell all day, morning sickness, but she insisted we attend. I should have listened to my instincts when Margaret cornered me in the kitchen while the others were in the dining room. She was preparing drinks, and I noticed she had separated one glass from the others. As I watched, she added something from a small bottle into it, quickly tucking the vial away when she heard footsteps. "This one's special for you," she said with a smile, "my favorite son-in-law." Something felt wrong. The glass had an odd sheen to it, barely noticeable, but there nonetheless. I thanked her and offered to help carry the drinks back. When we reached the dining room, I placed the tampered glass in front of David, instead of taking it myself, claiming I needed to use the loo. When I returned, David was already drinking deeply from his glass, making appreciative noises about Margaret's special recipe. 40 minutes later, David was violently ill, rushing to the bathroom every few minutes. Margaret kept insisting it must be food poisoning, but her face had gone pale when she realized what had happened. That night, I took the remaining drink to my mate James, who runs a forensics lab. Personal favor, I said. He didn't ask questions. 3 days later, he called me. "Mate, there's diazepam in here, enough to knock someone out for hours, possibly cause memory issues too. Where did this come from?" I didn't answer his question, but I did ask for a written report that evening. I told Sarah I needed some space, suggested we skip Sunday dinner for a while. She was disappointed, but pregnancy was exhausting her. Anyway, she understood. Over the next week, I started digging. Margaret had prescriptions for anxiety medication from multiple GPs around London. She had been doctor shopping for months. There were also whispers in Hampstead about her behavior at neighborhood events, missing jewelry accusations at her book club stories the family had worked hard to suppress. I compiled everything into a file and waited for the right moment. It came when Sarah mentioned her mother wanted professional photos taken for her church committee, specifically asked if you would do them. Sarah said, surprised by the unusual request. The following Saturday, I arrived at their house alone, camera equipment in one hand, sealed envelope in the other. David was at his golf club. Margaret was waiting, dressed impeccably, makeup perfect. "Before we begin," I said quietly, handing her the envelope, "thought you might want to see this." Inside was the toxicology report, along with copies of her multiple prescriptions. Her hands trembled as she read. "This is ridiculous," she whispered. "I would never." "We both know exactly what happened," I said, keeping my voice level. "What I don't know is why." Her facade cracked instantly. "You don't deserve Sarah. You're unreliable, unpredictable. Men like you abandon their families when things get difficult. And drugging me proves your point." "How exactly?" I asked. "It wasn't going to hurt you," she snapped, "just make you miss that important presentation. You had planned to show Sarah you're not dependable like she needs you to be." I let that sink in, then said calmly, "Here's what happens next. You tell David what you did, then you both start treating me with respect, not because you've changed your minds about me, but because the alternative is Sarah discovering who her parents really are." Margaret laughed, but it sounded hollow. "She'll never believe you over us." I picked up my camera bag. "Maybe not, but she'll believe the lab results and the prescription records and the neighbors you've alienated. Are you willing to bet your relationship with your daughter on that?" I left without taking a single photograph. That evening, Margaret called Sarah in tears, claiming I had been abusive during our session, said I had threatened her, and behaved inappropriately. When Sarah confronted me, I had no choice but to show her everything: the lab report, the prescriptions, even text messages Margaret had been sending me that grew increasingly hostile. "My mother wouldn't do this," Sarah kept saying, but her voice lacked conviction. The next day she confronted her parents alone. When she returned, her eyes were red and she looked exhausted. "Dad says it's all a misunderstanding," she said quietly, "that you're trying to cause problems because you're insecure about providing for us." I nodded. "I'd expected this. What do you think?" I asked. She didn't answer, just went to bed and turned away from me. For 2 weeks, Sarah barely spoke to me. She visited her parents, alone, coming home with fresh doubts about our relationship. I threw myself into work, spending long hours at my drafting table, waiting for the storm to pass. Then, something unexpected happened. A courier delivered a package with no return address, just my name, in unfamiliar handwriting. Inside was a USB drive and a note: "You need to see this," signed V.I.D. The drive contained security footage from Margaret and David's house. Timestamp showed the evening of the dinner. There was Margaret in the kitchen, clearly adding something to a drink. There was meandering, taking the glasses. There was David drinking from the wrong glass. But there was more footage from after we left: Margaret screaming at David, blaming him for drinking from the wrong glass. David shouting back, "This isn't the first time you've done something like this, is it?" I watched the clips multiple times, processing what I was seeing, not just proof of Margaret's actions, but evidence of a pattern David knew. The next file was from 2 days later: Margaret and David arguing in their sitting room. "He knows what you did," David said. "So what?" Margaret replied. "It's his word against mine. Sarah will never choose him over family, and if she does, then she's not the daughter I raised." "Don't worry, I've already started talking to her about their marriage problems, planting seeds," Margaret said coldly. "By the time she'll be considering divorce and thinking it was her idea." I closed my laptop, hands shaking. This wasn't just about me. This was systematic manipulation designed to control Sarah's entire life. I called the number on the note. "Hello, this is Victoria." David mentioned a daughter-in-law I hadn't met. "Why did you send this?" I asked. "Because they did the same thing to me," she said quietly. "When I married their son James 2 years ago, they tried everything to break us up, said I wasn't suitable for their family." James is David's son from his first marriage. I realized, why didn't you tell anyone? James doesn't know. Victoria admitted he adores his father, thinks David can do no wrong. "I've tried, but he believes in being paranoid. I couldn't watch them destroy someone else." That evening, I received a text from David: "We should talk man to man, no wives." We met at his club the next day. He was waiting in the members' lounge with a brandy Oliver. He began, "Families are complicated. My wife can be protective, but she means well. Drugging someone means, well," I asked. He dismissed it with a wave. "Misunderstanding. Margaret takes medication for her nerves. She probably confused the glasses." "I have the security footage, David." His expression changed instantly, becoming cold and calculating. "What do you want, money? Is that what this is about? I always suspected you married Sarah for financial gain." "I want you both to leave us alone," I said. "Stop interfering in our marriage. Stop trying to convince Sarah I'm unreliable." David leaned forward. "You think you're the first ambitious young man to chase my daughter?" He smiled. She was engaged before you met her lovely chap investment banker. We convinced her he was wrong. Took about 6 months. I felt sick. What are you talking about? Sarah was engaged to someone called Richard 2 years before she met you. Perfect match. Really, but we planted doubts, made her think he was unreliable. She broke it off, came home crying, thinking she'd made a terrible mistake. The pattern was clear. This wasn't about me personally. It was about control, absolute control over their daughter's life. I didn't confront Sarah immediately. Instead, I started gathering evidence. I contacted Richard, who initially refused to speak when I explained the situation. He agreed to meet. Oliver, he said, when we met at a coffee shop in South London, they destroyed my relationship with Sarah. Systematically convinced her I was seeing someone else, even staged fake evidence. By the time I could prove my innocence, she wouldn't listen anymore. I compiled everything: Richard's testimony, the security footage, Margaret's prescriptions. Then, I invited James and Victoria for dinner, without telling Sarah there was something they needed to see. We spent the evening watching the footage together. Sarah sat motionless, tears streaming down her face. James kept shaking his head, muttering, "That's not my stepmother." When it finished, Sarah turned to me. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she asked. "Because I needed you to see all of it," I replied, "not just what they did to me, but what they've been doing to you your entire life." The next morning, Margaret called Sarah early. "Darling," she said sweetly, "I've been thinking you should come stay with us for a while. Marriage can be difficult, and sometimes space helps." Sarah put the call on speaker. "Mum," she interrupted, "I've seen the videos." Silence. "Then what videos?" "The security footage of you drugging Oliver's drink, of you and Dad planning to break up my marriage." After a long pause, Margaret tried again. "Whatever Hayes shown you has been manipulated, darling. You know Oliver has always resented our family." "Stop," Sarah said firmly. "We're coming over tonight. All of us, James, Victoria, Oliver and me, we're going to discuss this properly." After she hung up, Sarah looked at me. "They'll deny everything, try to make you the villain." I nodded. "Probably." "What's our plan?" she asked. For the first time in weeks, I smiled. "I think it's time your parents discovered that not everyone can be manipulated." That evening we arrived with my laptop and all the evidence. James and Victoria were already there, sitting tensely in the drawing room. Margaret seemed confident. "This is highly irregular," she said. "We don't air family business with outsiders." "Exactly," I agreed, "which is why I've documented everything for the family." For the next 2 hours, we methodically presented the evidence: the drink, the manipulation, Richard, the pattern of control, Margaret, and David. Denied everything, called me vindictive, paranoid, but each denial was met with more proof. Finally, Sarah stood up. "Mom, Dad," she said quietly, "I love you both, but what you've done is unforgivable. You don't get to control my life anymore." James nodded reluctantly. "We're adults. We choose our own partners." Margaret began crying, not from remorse, but from losing control. David looked stunned, as if he couldn't believe his children were defying him. As we prepared to leave, I handed David a USB drive. "This contains everything I said, the footage, the evidence, the testimonies." "What am I supposed to do with this?" he asked. "Nothing," I replied, "as long as you respect our boundaries. But if you ever try to manipulate Sarah again or interfere in our marriage, copies go to everyone at your golf club, your former colleagues, and your precious neighbors." For the first time since I'd met him, David looked at me with something approaching respect. 6 months passed. Sarah and James both started therapy to process years of manipulation. Margaret and David kept their distance, sending occasional texts, but respecting the boundaries we'd established. Then, at Christmas, they invited everyone for dinner, a fresh start. The card read, "Sarah wanted to go there. Still my parents," she said, "and they're trying." I agreed, though I wasn't naive enough to believe they'd truly changed. When we arrived, everything seemed normal. Margaret had prepared an elaborate meal. David was charming, asking about my latest projects with apparent genuine interest. After dinner, David invited me to his study. "I have something to discuss," he said, pouring whiskey. "I've been reconsidering your career," he began. "Architecture has been lucrative for you, hasn't it? Perhaps more stable than I initially thought." I took the glass but didn't drink. "What are you getting at?" "I've spoken to some colleagues," David continued, "developers who might need your services. Exclusive contracts, steady income, what do you think?" I set the glass down untouched. "Why would you help me now?" "Because you're family," he said, "and I respect." How you handled our difficulties, you protected Sarah while standing your ground, that's admirable. This is another attempt at control, isn't it? I said. You can't buy my compliance, David. His mask slipped slightly. Everyone has a price, Oliver. That's where you're wrong, I replied, and that's why you'll never understand your daughter. I returned to the dining room where Margaret was showing Sarah old photo albums. Look how happy you were living at home, she was saying. Sarah caught my eye. She could tell something had happened from my expression. I gave a slight shake of my head, and she stood up. Mom, Dad, she announced, clearly I have something to tell you, we're having a baby. The shock was genuine. Margaret immediately embraced her with tears. David approached more cautiously. Congratulations, he said stiffly. Thank you, I replied, then, lowering my voice so only he could hear this, child will never be a pawn in your games. He nodded once, understanding the message. 3 weeks later, a registered letter arrived from David's solicitor. Inside were the deeds to our flat, which we'd been renting, and documents establishing a trust fund for our unborn child. No note, no conditions, just the transfer of assets. It wasn't an apology, David wasn't capable of that, but it was acknowledgement that we'd won. Our son was born that summer. We named him William after my grandfather when Margaret and David visited the hospital. They brought gifts but kept respectful distance. They admired the baby, took photos, and left without offering unsolicited advice. Months passed. Our relationship with them settled into something resembling normalcy. They never apologized, but they stopped trying to control Sarah's life or undermine my career. One evening, as I worked on house plans in my study, Sarah came in carrying William. Mom called. She said she wants us for Christmas dinner. I looked up. What do you want to do? I think we should go, she replied, but with conditions. We stay at a hotel. We leave when we want, no unsupervised time with William. Sounds reasonable, I agreed. She sat beside me, bouncing the baby gently. You know, I used to think success meant earning my parents' approval, meeting their expectations. And now, I asked, now I know it's about making choices I can live with. She looked at William, then at me standing by the people I love. 2 weeks before Christmas, a thick envelope arrived from David's office. Inside was the annual report for a development company. ID never heard of my architectural drawings, were featured throughout buildings ID designed over the past year. There was a brief note, thought you should see where your work ended up, rather impressive. Portfolio developing quite a reputation. It was signed simply D. It wasn't forgiveness or reconciliation. It was acknowledgement that I had succeeded on my own terms, despite their interference. That spring, I opened my own architectural firm in a converted warehouse in Hove. At the launch party, Sarah stood beside me, William in her arms. My parents had driven down from Yorkshire. Clients and colleagues filled the space, admiring the models and drawings. Margaret and David came too. They didn't stay long. Margaret held William briefly under Sarah's watchful eye. David examined my work with professional interest and left without making suggestions about how I should run my business. As we locked up that night, Sarah asked, "Do you think they've really changed?" I considered carefully. No, I said finally, but they've accepted they can't change us, and sometimes that's enough. Later, as we sat in our garden overlooking the sea, William asleep upstairs, I realized something ID never articulated before. I hadn't won by playing their game. ID won by refusing to play at all. ID stood my ground, protected what mattered, and built my life according to my own definition of success, not through manipulation or schemes, but with honesty and quiet determination. In the end, that was the most satisfying revenge, living well on my own terms with the family I loved beside me. Margaret and David had tried to control the narrative, but ultimately the story was mine to write, and I had written it exactly as I chose. Years later, when William started asking questions about his grandparents, Sarah and I would tell him that family relationships can be complicated, but that love means respecting boundaries and supporting each other's dreams. We taught him that success isn't measured by others' expectations, but by staying true to your values and protecting the people you care about. Margaret and David became distant but cordial grandparents. They sent birthday cards and Christmas gifts, but never again tried to dictate how we should live our lives. They had learned the hard way that some people cannot be controlled, and that attempting to do so only drives them further away. My architectural practice thrived not because of their eventual acceptance, but despite their initial opposition. I built my reputation on integrity and innovation, exactly the qualities they'd once dismissed as unreliable. The irony wasn't lost on me that their attempts to destroy my credibility had only made me more determined to succeed. Sarah completed her PhD and now lectures at the University of Brighton. She speaks often about the importance of independence and critical thinking skills that served her well when she finally saw her parents clearly for who they were. Sometimes late at night when the house is quiet and William is sleeping, I think about that dinner, the moment when Margaret handed me that poisoned glass, and how different things might have been if I'd actually drunk it. But then I remember that the best revenge isn't about evening scores. It's about building a life so fulfilling that your enemy's actions become irrelevant. That's the story of how I learned that the most powerful response to manipulation isn't retaliation, it's simply refusing to be manipulated, and then living well despite their efforts to bring you down.